Welcome to Control Your Career, a podcast to help you conquer uncertainty, shatter imposter syndrome, and rise above the expectations imposed by others. My name is Julia Toothacre, and I am the career coach and strategist at Ride the Tide Collective, my career development company, where I offer career coaching, courses, and I have a plethora of free content. I have been doing this work for well over a decade, and I want to help empower professionals like you find clarity, navigate your career with intention, and help you advance in your career in alignment with your unique personality, preferences, and values. This podcast is a great place to start your journey toward controlling your career. I'm bringing back the ever-popular Recruiter's Perspective theme for Season 11 with a new group of recruiters and talent acquisition professionals to help you understand the hiring process from their lens. We'll be digging into resume and interview tips, talking about how the ATS works, looking at the history of the job market, and we'll be tackling hot button topics in recruiting and hiring. This is going to be a season full of great advice, tips, and uncovering the truth about the hiring process from those who are on the front lines of hiring. Find this episode and more at ridethetidecollective.com and connect with me on LinkedIn, where I post career information and inspiration to help you control your career. Hey everyone, we are here to do the season 11 wrap up. This was the Recruiter's Perspective 2025. And let me tell you, we had a lot of perspectives on this season. First of all, thank you to everyone who has been with us for this season. It has been such an amazing season with a lot of diverse perspectives and a couple of, special episodes that we did that I think honestly provided some amazing perspective, just given where we are in the world today. So one thing that I do want to just reaffirm with this podcast, and I think that this season really emulated that, is I am here to help professionals take control of their career. That's the purpose of the podcast. That's the purpose of the work that I do. And this season is no exception to that. I think there was so much amazing information that my guests shared that for some of you is really going to hit home. For others, you might have some pushback. You might have a different experience. I know that that was something that, especially on social media, I did see some pushback quite a bit. And honestly, I love the discourse when we can have a really good conversation. Here's what I will say, though. I think there is appropriate discourse in a way that we can challenge each other. And I think that that's amazing. We can challenge the system, right? I love that. One thing that I'm not okay with is when we come up against somebody's story. And this did happen a number of times. One in particular, if you follow me on social media, you know what I'm talking about. But what I will not tolerate from people who follow me or comment on my content is really making my guests feel less than because they are sharing their personal experience. That is not okay. So I'm setting that standard up right now that, while I do welcome discourse, I do not welcome you, coming at my guests and insulting them. And the other thing that I do not appreciate is death threats, which I also received this season. That was a new one for me, but here we are. They got blocked and reported and we're good. But yeah, it's been an interesting season to say the least. But I think that it really speaks to the fact that these topics are really important and they hit home for a lot of people. There's a lot of emotions around hiring. There's a lot of emotions around the process and what's right and what's wrong. And there are so many different perspectives. And so I think that because I brought on so many diverse voices, we saw a lot of perspectives and some people agreed with it and some people didn't. And you know what? That's okay as long as we can still stay kind to each other and have really good, conversations. So one of the things that we are going to talk about in this episode is I'm going to go over some of the common themes that I saw through some of the questions that I asked. So there were sets of questions throughout the majority of the interviews where I was getting perspectives to make sure that we can compare and contrast those perspectives across the season. So I'm going to do that first. We're going to talk about some of the hiring basics and what the different perspectives were. I am then going to talk about just some themes that I saw that emerged as well. We're going to touch on some of the special episodes. And then at the end, one of the things that I want to do is talk about AI. This was a big conversation, and there were some things that came out this season and some pushback that I received um, again in the comments and things like that. And so I want to be really honest about the future of AI in recruiting. And so we did some research on that, and I want to share that with you because I think some of what was shared in this season is different than what is being marketed right now. So I want to talk about that. And I think that'll be really helpful for people who are trying to figure out how AI is impacting the recruiting space and the hiring space. All right. Okay, let's jump in with resume tips. Okay, this was something that I asked everybody. I wanted to understand, what everybody's main resume tips were. I think this is so important when we're talking to recruiters. What does that look like? So some of the common themes that we saw across the board were lead with impact, use metrics and action verbs. And something that I heard as well, especially because of the ATS, is you can go on to 2 pages. You can have a multi-page resume. I think that's something that gets pushed a lot that, oh, you have to stay to 1 page. You have to stay to 1 page. It's very hard to do that, especially when you get into your mid-career and you do have really good and relevant experience. Obviously, you want to make sure that it aligns to the position. It's still a marketing document. But that was something that was mentioned multiple times. So a couple of highlights throughout. We had Oscar who talked about bullet points should be specific. Numbers are your friend in terms of outcomes. I heard that from multiple people. Anytime that you can have those numbers, you can have outcomes, it's absolutely going to enhance your resume. Oh, I loved this from Katie. She said, I would rather you just have a size 11 font and 3 pages than an 8, than an 8 font, 8 size font. And I have to squint. I think it's funny, but so relatable, even though, everything is read online and we can zoom in and all of that. That 8-point font is too small, you guys. Smallest I would go is 10. But to Katie's point, if you need a little bit more space, just go on to the extra pages, but also really evaluate what you have going on there. I loved this from Danny. He really pushed this idea of having a story, right? Having a career story. And I think that was such great advice that he shared. And that story gets weaved into your resume in terms of how you talk about your experiences, right? Let's see, Silvana. Okay. I loved this advice from her. I talked about it in my mid-season wrap up. She talked about summary. So this is like the top of the resume when you have a little summary, professional summary. First of all, don't have an objective statement. That's very antiquated. But when you do a summary, professional summary, you want to use bullet points. Don't use a paragraph. It's very hard to read. And a lot of times it's very generic. So if you're going to do a professional summary, have bullet points of your best accomplishments or things that you just want them to know and highlight. One thing I will say that came out of Omar's episode is if you are going to be applying abroad and language is something that you need to be aware of, then in that professional summary, make sure you talk about the languages that you know, because that pulls that information to the top versus having it toward the bottom in a skills section. So that's something that you want to be aware of. All right, now let's get into interview tips. Some of the common themes that I saw was being prepared with stories, asking smart questions, and showing genuine interest. I actually thought that was kind of funny, but I think in this day and age, I'm really not surprised. I think people have a lot of fatigue with the hiring process, and sometimes it's like, I just want a job. And so they might not have done all the homework that they need to do. One thing that Lara said that I thought was actually really good, especially when you're going through a lot of interviews or you have panel interviews or something like that. She said, even if you've talked to 12 people, ask the 13th person a question. And so I think sometimes if we're in kind of a interview fatigue situation, especially if you've been in interviews all day, you've asked the same question over and over again. But remember that the person sitting across from you, this is the first time they've been asked this question by you. So even though it seems repetitive to you, it's not repetitive to them. And so make sure that you are continuing to ask people about something that has to do with the company, their experience, or your position and how it interacts with them. One thing that I love to ask if you don't have any specific questions are ego questions. And so these are questions that allow the person to talk about their experience, again, within the organization, within their position, or how they work with the department that you're a part of. That's an easy way to get people to start talking because they're talking about themselves. One thing that I loved from Jamie is she said, use AI as a guide, but don't read from it in the interview. So I saw this really fun video and I should have reposted it on my TikTok, but it was a woman who was doing a like a Zoom interview, an online interview, and she had the interview window, in the top, and then she had all these sticky notes, electronic sticky notes on her screen with different questions and bullet point answers for those questions. I loved that. I thought that was such a great idea, especially if you get nervous or you think that you're going to forget something. It's a really quick way to just be able to look and get that, oh, yeah, this is what I'm going to talk about here. But even if you use AI to help you prep for interviews, don't do everything that it says. It still needs to be about your experience and your story. So remember those common themes. Be prepared with stories, and they need to be your stories, not AI's stories. One thing that I loved that Orlando said, and this can happen in online interviews, but more common in person, because online you can actually see the person's name. But in person, write down the names of people, especially if you're in a panel interview. Make sure that you have paper with you, a pad of paper, notebook, something like that. Write down everybody's name, take notes. It shows that you're engaged. It shows that you are really taking it seriously. And I know sometimes people are like, oh no, you need to be making eye contact. Yes, make eye contact, but also take those notes. You're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. So if they say something that you want to follow up on, or you want to make sure that you respond and say something specific, jot down that note. Nobody is going to say anything, that's something that that you do professionally anyway. So don't feel like you're going to get dinged for that. One of the things that Omar said, and honestly, I think everybody said this at some point, was ask questions. It is a red flag when people don't ask questions. And the reason that it's a red flag is because, again, they want to know that you are interested. So when we go back to those common themes, show genuine interest. So if you're not asking questions, then I don't know how much research you've done. It makes it seem like you haven't done any. Or it might make it seem like you're not really engaged in the conversation, right? Or you don't want to know more about the position, especially if you're in with a hiring manager. Sometimes there's limitations with the recruiter and what they can answer, but they can talk about the company. They can talk generally about the position, so there is still information that you can share, but always, always, always come prepared with questions. And I will say it should be a combination of questions about the organization and your position, but also questions that align with your values. So, what are things that you care about or ways that you work, things that you want to know to ensure that you are stepping into the right organization with the right manager and all of that? Oh, I really loved this. Silvana, she shared such great tips. And one of the things that she said was ask about why a role is open. And I I loved that. She said that will tell you what you're walking into. And I think this day and age with with so many layoffs and restructures and all of that, you do want to get an idea of why this position is open. Is it a new position? Did somebody decide to leave of their own volition? Was there, a reduction in workforce and this was reclassified? They might not tell you that. But if you can find that out, I think it's really helpful, especially if it is a new position, because if it's a new position, that opens up a world of questions for you. And then also for people who are really creative and love a challenge, sometimes those new positions are really great. But if you're looking for stability, that might not be the best option for you. It kind of depends on the situation. Okay, let's talk about cover letters. Cover letters are always so funny when I do this season because I tend to get really varied answers. I will say I think these are the most consistent answers that I've seen. The majority of people said don't bother unless it's required. And I think that's pretty common advice these days. I know that there's a lot of people who won't apply if a cover letter is required. A lot of people will say if a cover letter is optional to make sure that you submit one. But what I was hearing from these recruiters was at their level, they're not looking at cover letters. They look at the resume, their matching experience, and all of that. And the cover letter, a lot of times, will get read by the hiring manager. And so you have to think about that. And a lot of times for people who are making a career switch, a cover letter is a really great way to make a case for that career switch. So I know a lot of you are anti-cover letters, and in a lot of ways I am too. But if it can help you, then you definitely want to consider it. One thing that I will say when it comes to cover letters, and Omar, Omar did talk about this. He said, you can tell when they're AI generated. I'm not a fan. So if you are going to use AI, make sure that you give it writing samples so that it understands your voice, your word choices and language patterns. But also you have to give it information. And so a cover letter is going to have some like generic sounding parts to it, but it's also going to be a story about you and why you want to work there and why your experience is going to be the best experience for that position. And so if you're not feeding it enough information, then it's going to write something really generic and it's going to sound really generic. And if you're going to do that, then there's honestly no point. So make sure that when you write it, you're writing it in a way that sounds authentic to who you are. Oscar's hot take was that the cover letter is dead, and that's because it's a bandwidth problem. I think that's true in a lot of organizations that are much larger or get really high levels of applications. But I know I come from higher education and the cover letter is not dead. Every application asks for a cover letter and you need to write it a certain way, and it's a whole thing. So it really just depends on the field that you're in, and then also just the frequency of applications that the company is getting for that position, or just that they get. Think about Google's and Apple's. Like they're going to get a lot of applications. They don't care about a cover letter at that point. So kind of reiterating what Danny was sharing in terms of stories, he said, make it count. Tell a story, don't just copy and paste. I think that's part of it. It has to speak to why you want to work at that company and the connection. Orlando said, I don't care, but the hiring manager might. If it's required, do it right. So I think that's also really good cover letter advice there from Orlando. But ultimately, it depends, seems to be, the consistent messaging when it comes to cover letters. All right, ATS. Look, this one of the most controversial opinions that we can have out there is around ATS, what it does, what it doesn't do. Some of the themes that we saw through this season is that the ATS is not rejecting you. Humans are. And I know some of you are going to fight with me on that. And formatting is not really your issue, it's relevance. So let's dig into that a little bit more. One of the things that Oscar says, the ATS is a filing cabinet, not a gatekeeper. Humans reject you, not the software. That was so common across the board from what we saw. And again, this is specific to the recruiters that I spoke to. All of them said our people go through every application. Now, their system might rank resumes and applications. But a lot of times what I saw shared was when they post a position, they're in there immediately. When they start getting applications, they are looking at those applications and they're, yes, no, yes, no. So that kind of prompted me as I went throughout the season to give the advice of if you are applying, try to apply within the first 28 to 48 hours. Because if they have a really solid candidate pool within the first couple of days, they might not close the position, but your resume also might not get looked at, right? Or it might go through another round if the first round doesn't work out. But right now, a lot of times that first round of people is going to have somebody in it that likely is going to get the job. So you want to apply early. And at this point, assume that a human is going to look at it. But I'm going to talk about AI toward the end of this and talk about some of the changes that we are seeing. But in the context of the recruiters that I spoke to, humans are reading your resume. It's not getting filtered out by an applicant tracking system. Now, what sometimes will happen is there will be knockout questions. This was talked about, especially early in the season. Those knockout questions can automatically get you out. So if they ask for how many years of experience, if they ask for a certain job title, if they're asking certain questions, they're looking for a certain answer. And if you don't give that answer, then they're automatically rejecting you based on that. So that might be some of what is happening for some of you. It just depends. But it's been something that I think is very controversial. And we saw differing opinions. One of the things that Katie said was there's no AI in our process. We read resumes ourselves. Orlando, similarly, he said, you're not kicked out of the system. You're just waiting to be found. And so for him, he talked about keyword relevancy. And so making sure that your position has the keywords for the type of role that you're applying for. So this can become complicated if you're trying to make a career switch. If you're trying to make a career switch, you're going to have to adjust some of that language to make sure that it's aligning with the future position. And for some of you, that can be challenging if you're making a big switch. So that could be some of the holdup with you not getting, quote unquote, not getting through the system. Julia here. Are you feeling stuck in your career, unsure of how to break through to the next level? I'm excited to share a transformative opportunity. The Career Advancement Intensive. It's a focused one-day experience designed specifically for ambitious professionals ready to define their career path. In this immersive session, you'll work one-on-one with me to help you gain fresh insights into your professional strengths and uncover opportunities for growth. Together, you'll clarify your goals, refine your personal brand, and develop a strategic roadmap tailored to your unique aspirations. Imagine leaving the day with renewed confidence, a clear vision of your next steps, and practical actions you can implement immediately. As a bonus, you'll receive additional resources, tools to enhance your resume, optimize your online presence, and deepen your understanding of what drives you professionally. Not all coaching requires a 6-month commitment. The Career Advancement Intensive is perfect for ambitious professionals who want answers and strategies quickly. Before committing, let's make sure that this program is the best option for you in my complimentary career coaching clarity call. The link will be in the show notes and description for this episode. Now, let's get back to the show. Okay, let's talk about, so those were some of like the basics, the questions that I asked everybody. But I also want to talk about just some of the general themes that I saw come up through this. And again, y'all, I've got notes, okay? Like I'm not trying to make this whole episode from the top of my head. We have notes. If you see me looking off to the side, that's what it is. But our first theme that came out, and this is likely because I wanted to really talk about pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, was that job searching really looks different today. And we saw that talked about by multiple people. I know one of the things, let me see. Oh, okay. One of the things that Katie shared, I'm sorry, I've got like quotes from people that I pulled, so I want to make sure that I'm using them appropriately. So one of the things that Katie shared was people think they're doing something wrong because they're not getting interviews, but the market has changed. I think this is such a huge insight right now is you're approaching things the way that you used to, and you used to get a result, and now you're not. And that was one thing that I heard multiple recruiters say. It's not you. I know I shared that multiple times about my conversations with clients. It's not you. You used to be able to submit a resume and get an interview. You used to not have to submit so many resumes, and even though I'm a, quality over quantity person, even then, usually my clients who are more targeted will at least get the interview. Some have had success and some haven't. What I have found is the ones who are in very niche areas tend to have more success because they have some type of specialization that the organization wants. Now, the issue there is a lot of their positions are few and far between. So there's benefits, and negatives to having a really niche career versus having a more broad career. But either way, it has changed. One of the things that Oscar said that I thought was a really great insight was there are more good candidates than ever. And so the difference now is timing and alignment. And so that kind of goes back to what I was saying about applying within the first 24 to 48 hours. We have so many people who have similar career trajectories, similar experiences, and you're trying to choose between two candidates and it's almost impossible because they read so similarly. And I think I talked about this on my manager's perspective season where I asked them, how do you choose between two candidates that look basically the same, that you feel good about both of them? And so many of my managers said, we bring other people in, we have them do a panel interview. We bring in people that they'd be interacting with, and we make it a group decision so that there's not any kind of unknown bias there. But either way, it's still really hard because so many people have such good experiences that it might come down to one has just a little bit more experience, or they have this thing over that thing, and so I think that's really helpful to understand. Let's see, one of the other themes that I saw throughout, and this kind of goes back to the ATS, is that even though these systems exist and AI exists, even though they are saying they're not using it, human behavior will still drive more decisions than systems. And that's because at the end of the day, a recruiter, even if you've been pulled to the top by some kind of ranking system, a recruiter is still going to review your resume and your application before they recommend it to a hiring manager. And then the hiring manager is going to go through that information and they're going to accept or reject. They're going to do an interview and they are the ones that are going to make the decision. And so it really is still at its core more of a human process than it's not. Now, I'm going to talk again about how ATS is coming in and changing a little bit of that. And that's a little bit scary. So again, stay tuned for that. At the end of the episode, I'm going to be going into that. Um, but one thing that Bridget said, and I didn't explicitly ask her the same questions that I asked the other recruiters, because her and I were having more of a special discussion around DEI. But she said it's not about who's most qualified in a lot of scenarios, it's who's liked and trusted. And so when we talk about the hiring process, sometimes we think, oh, it's not fair. They're hiring their friends. Yeah, they are. They are. And I think that's what makes this so frustrating for so many people, is they see who got hired over them, and they see that it was a friend. They see that it was somebody that they've worked with in the past. So you see a leader bringing in people that they know, that they trust, and in some cases, those people are qualified, and in some cases, they're not. And that's where we see that human behavior is going to drive a lot of those decisions, whether they are the most ethical decisions or not. Um, One of the things that Lara said was, we gravitate to people who remind us of ourselves. That's human, but it's also bias. We talked a lot about bias in Tank's episode, and then also in my episode with Bridget, those two special episodes. That was something that also came up. And I love that Lara also talked about that, right? Like, there is going to be bias in the hiring process, and we have to be aware of that if we are recruiting, if we are a hiring manager. And, one of the things I appreciated, especially in my conversation with Tank, is, we did talk about the like racial ethnicities and all of that, but it's not just that. And I think that's what people have to understand, is it's not just we physically look the same, but it could be the school that you went to. It could be, you know, where you grew up. You shouldn't be talking about those things, but there are things that people latch onto in an interview where they see themselves in the other person because you have a bias and you're trying to look for that connection. And so you might accept somebody that doesn't have as good an experience because you see yourself in them. And is that the best hiring decision? Right. And so that's where a lot of this, again, our humanness really drives those decisions. And sometimes that's going to be unfair. It's going to be frustrating, especially when you know that you are really well qualified and they are hiring somebody else. Some advice that I gave a client of mine not too long ago, because they kept getting to final round interviews and not getting the position. And so we talked about that. And what I encouraged them to do was actually go to LinkedIn or to the company website and see who got hired. Because if you can see who got hired and if there's a connection, or do they look the same? Did they go to the same school? Like, what could it be? Was it really an experience thing, or was it a networking thing? That I think is really helpful for those of us that make it to the final round and don't get it, to be able to look critically and go, okay, I can see why this person got it over me. Or like, okay, well, everybody in the office looks this way and they hired the person that looks like them and I don't look like them. That happens, right? Tank talked about that. So that's just something to be aware of in the hiring process. Is it always fair? No. Do we have protections in place to help? Yes. But you just never know if those protections are going to be enough, or if you can actually make a case for it, which is extremely difficult to do with the EEOC. Okay. And then my third observation across this season was self-awareness. Self-awareness matters more now than it ever has. I think that is something that we saw throughout all the interviews, including my special episodes. You have to know who you are. You have to understand, like, what you bring to the table. You have to understand your career story. You have to understand all of these components of yourself. And I think sometimes, especially our newer professionals, will struggle with that because they just have not found themselves professionally yet. But anytime that you can really craft that story, who am I? What do I bring to the table? What is unique about me? What is different about me? To Danny's point about the story, what is your story and how are you going to tell it and how are you going to talk about it? This is something that I do with my clients all the time. What are those 3 to 5 words, phrases, things that you want to be known for that make you you? And make sure that that runs through everything so that when I read your resume, I read a cover letter, I interview you, I go to your LinkedIn, I see that content repeated. And I know that is who you are and I understand who you are. Again, I got to go back to Danny. He was so good about this. He said, if you don't know your story, someone else will write it for you. And I felt like that was so profound because that's a lot of what I do. I help people control their career. I help people get out of scenarios where they were not controlling where they wanted to go. They were not controlling the narrative. They were letting somebody else do it for them because they were taking opportunities that other people suggested versus really figuring out what they wanted and going after that or looking at those opportunities really critically. One thing that Julie shared that I thought was so great, she talked about the AI and Chat GPT, and she said, don't outsource your voice to Chat GPT, make it sound like you. So AI and ChatGPT in particular has a certain way that it writes and a certain way that it sounds. And if you've been, using it for a period of time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so you have to feed it information. You have to give it, writing samples, transcripts of you speaking. So that's one way that I train my AI is I give it transcripts. So podcast episode transcripts, I will feed it so that it understands how I speak, the language I use, my cadence, all of that. And then that helps it create information and content that sounds like me, right? And so it's the same thing for cover letters. You want to make sure that you are giving it some kind of source material and then giving it enough information so that it does sound like you. And then edit. I think that's the best thing that you can do. And then pulling again from Bridget's episode, her episode was a lot about what is going on with DEI. And we were trying to really hone in on the facts of what's going on and the realities of how some of these things have played out over the years with our experiences and all of that. And one of the things that Bridget shared that I thought was honestly, I think something great for all of us was when DEI training is done well, it helps people step back and ask, what am I bringing into this moment? And so DEI gets a lot of backlash, and a lot of that is because of how people have experienced it in the workplace. And Bridget and I, if you watch that episode, I mean, we really dive into that and some of the nuances there. But at the end of the day, if you are looking at those opportunities and going, okay, I know why I'm here. What can I gain from this? What can I bring that's helpful in terms of perspective, but also what can I take away and apply to myself? I think it's all about how are we showing up and what is our intention in showing up in those spaces. And I think because of how some DEI trainers have approached it, it hasn't always been positive. But again, our reactions are a choice to that. And so that was a lot of what we were trying to get across is like, look, not every training is going to be the best training, but how can you as an individual look at it and go, you know what, here's what I'm taking away from it. This maybe wasn't exactly how I would have done it, but I get what they're saying and let's take what we can take and move on from that. One thing I loved that Jamie talked about, and remember, she talked a lot about that career gap. She's military wife, started a family, all these different things going on. And she said, be clear on what you want, not just what you're running away from. And I loved that insight from her. A lot of times when we are making a switch, we look at a position and we go, okay, I got to get out of here. I don't want to be here anymore. And we just move on to the next thing without really thinking about it. And the problem is we take our baggage with us, right? And so one way that we can control our career is to look at our situation and go, okay, what is really happening? I need to be realistic, right? I talk about realistic reality. What does that look like here? And then how can I make sure to make changes in the next opportunity, right? Now, caveat to that is really toxic situations or abusive situations. Obviously, get out of those. Don't worry about this. But for the average person, we do need to talk about what is going on. What do you need? Make sure that you are looking for something different in the next position. Okay, AI. Okay. Y'all, this is something that I think people fought with me the most in the comments of social media posts for this season, was the use of AI within hiring. Now, here's what I believe. While we were filming this season, I think that my recruiters that came on, I think that they were very honest about what their companies were doing and what they were doing. However, throughout this season, we also saw a lot of evolutions within AI happen. And so I wanted to do some research because it was a big topic and I wanted to make sure that I was being realistic because I don't want to lead you astray as well. And the reality is that companies that, create ATS systems and recruiting software and all of that, AI is coming for that. Now, whether or not an organization uses those features and functions, yet to be determined, don't know what's going to happen there. But as of right now, I'm starting to see companies, market it and implement it. And so let's see. I had to do my research on this one because it is so new. So there are a couple of companies that I was able to look and see what they were doing. One is Smart Recruiters. So it says that they are phasing out traditional ATS in favor of AI native systems that automate candidate ranking, engagement, and orchestration. And so what that means is the front end of this process is going to be led by AI. Regardless of how you feel about it, it's happening. And again, I don't know how much a recruiter or an organization will have control in that. A lot of times, even if it does rank, you can usually go back and look at all the applications and kind of figure out what's going on. So we'll see what that looks like. Another company, Atlas, which I guess is a newer recruiting platform. They have AI agents that are built into the workflows for resume screening, candidate matching, task automation, and analytics. So it's designed for high volume agency style recruiting. So that's a little bit different when you're talking about an agency. They're going to be looking for specific things. They've got their lists of people and all of that. But what I'm also seeing is that it's not just the candidate ranking, but it's, the workflow in terms of, the automation piece, which automation has been here within recruiting. But I guess at this point, they're saying it's going to be more AI powered, which likely might give some more, I don't know, just some more customization to it or things like that. So we'll see. I mean, again, this was very basic research that I did. I didn't dig too deeply into it. And then another company, Manitol, they use AI resume scoring, filtering, and enrichment. Oh, you guys are gonna hate this. Even pulling from publicly available social data, probably LinkedIn, to rank candidates within seconds. So, oof, for those of you who have been anti LinkedIn or not wanting to engage, that's going to be a good reason to get on and make sure that your information is updated, make sure that you're posting, you're active, doing something, because now we're going to start seeing probably anything linked to your phone number or email. If I had to guess, that's how it works. They're going to be able to see and they're going to be able to pull. Again, if it's public, if you have your things set to private, then it won't pull that. But that is something that everybody needs to be aware of is coming. Okay. Um, so one of the things that I was also reading about is AI in early interviews and screening. And so some people, I've seen this on social media, people interacting with an AI interviewer, which I think is so weird, but it's here. Okay. I don't know how that's helpful. I don't know what that looks like on the back end. But that is something that is starting to pop up. And so they're calling them like virtual recruiters. They can conduct phone and video screenings. They can evaluate responses. They can transmit summaries to human recruiters. So these are things that are in the pipeline that are happening. So if you've experienced them, yeah, it's real. If you thought that you were talking to an AI, you probably were, unless it was disclosed to you. One thing I will say too is it seems like some of the larger companies especially are wanting to use AI as a way to promote fairness and consistency within hiring. Um, I love that in theory. The problem is we have lawsuits out right now with certain companies because their AI was biased. And so I don't know how close we are to the AI being fair. I think it depends on how it's programmed, but then it also depends on how recruiters then choose candidates within that, because it's going to end up taking that information in as well and going, oh, you like candidates that have this, you like candidates that have that. I don't know all the technological nuance on that, but I don't know that we're quite in a place where the AI is actually unbiased. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see how companies deal with that and what it looks like. Okay, so let's talk about some positives and some negatives. Again, I'm reading off notes because I wanted to make sure that I stayed on track with this. So some of the positives of using AI, especially in the screening process, which is where it seems to be showing up the most, is AI can process a lot of applications quickly. And so it can help move people through the pipeline faster. But again, the downside to that is we have to make sure that the bias is figured out. It can reduce administrative burden, again, because of the efficiency of it. Not only that, but it can do a lot of the email follow-ups, scheduling, pre-screening, all of that. That also comes with automation, not necessarily AI. So I know that some of those things exist already in that realm. So I don't quite know how AI is going to impact that. So that'll be yet to be seen. Again, theoretically, there is potential for less human bias. I think it depends on what the AI is trained to look at, because if it's trained to look at names, locations, education, all that, you're taking away the skill part of it. I don't know. It's just going to be really interesting to see how they deal with bias, because it might not work the way that they want it to. So that's something I might have to do a little bit more research on. And anybody listening, if you have additional details or experience, please contact me, because I would love to get other people's experiences and thoughts on this. Consistency across applicants, and that's in terms of just the communication, and making sure that everybody's having the same experience, and then ideally data-driven decisions. And so again, because AI can process so much information, there's a lot of data that can be pulled, even in terms of looking at, hey, for this position, these were some of the themes we saw in the candidate pool, right? And so maybe that can help in terms of, adjusting a job description or changing whatever that looks like. Okay, some of the negatives of using AI. Obviously bias. We've talked about that. Um, so it depends on how this AI is trained, and it depends on the information that it's taking in as you use it more and more, because it's likely going to detect whatever hiring biases you are already picking up on. So again, it's going to be really interesting. One of the things that I found was that in 2018, Amazon had to scrap its AI resume screener after it penalized resumes with the word women's or female coded names. Right. And so again, this is all going to come down to how the AI is trained and what information it takes in and keeps, and just how it's all done. Um, in some cases, we might have a lack of transparency. They might not, a candidate might not know why they were filtered out because, again, everything becomes automated. A lot of that automation already exists. So that's really not anything terribly new. That we're going to get an over reliance on keywords. And this is already an issue because filters exist in ATS, but it's going to be even more so in AI, right? Because you have to have those keywords. And if you don't have it exactly, then it might overlook your resume. And so that can be really frustrating for applicants to feel like they have to use the exact phrasing, but they can't use a version of that. A lot of times, I think with AI, it's going to overlook the soft skills, again, unless it's trained to look for that, but that might not be consistent with each applicant. It's going to be articulated different. It's going to look different. Context matters in terms of the type of company that you've worked for. Is it a large company, a small company? So I think there's going to be a lot of nuance that AI is not necessarily going to be able to pick up on, again, unless it's trained. And then potentially, and I think this is actually one of the most important ones outside of bias, is candidate experience risks. And so what that means is when we have such an automated system, everything feels flat. It doesn't feel like there's a relationship. It doesn't feel like we're dealing with humans. And then it becomes, do I really want to work for this organization? Do I really want to work at this company where I'm not even having a human experience? So for all of y'all who've been fighting me on AI throughout this season, I think it is coming. I think there are going to be companies that are switching over to it, but I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it's embraced by recruiters, hiring managers, and candidates. I think it's going to get bad before it gets better. I think there's going to be a lot of potential for lawsuits. I think there's going to be potential for discrimination and bias. I think we have a lot of hurdles to get over. The companies that are implementing it now, again, I haven't looked super in depth with how they're doing it, but they're going to have to address all of these things. So it's just going to be really interesting. But anyway, thank you so much for being with me on this season. This was so fun, and I'm looking forward to next season. It's going to be a good one. We have a big announcement that I'm going to be making in the first episode of next season, so make sure that you stick around with that. As always, I am here to answer any questions. Feel free to reach out to me. LinkedIn is usually the best place to do that. If you're not already following me there, I highly encourage you to. I post a lot of content to help you control your career. And if you are not on my email list, I also recommend that you get on that. That is where you hear about my episodes when they first come out. And again, there's a big announcement that I have coming at the launch of season 12. You will be the first to know about. So thank you so much for sticking with me. And that is a wrap on the Recruiter's Perspective 2025.